We are quickly approaching the end of 2024 and are less than a year away from Germany's next federal election. In this video, I want to look at the current polling averages for each party to kind of get a picture of what we can expect from that result. Now, the elections for the German Bundestag, Germany's federal parliament, are held every 4 years, and the last election was in September of 2021. So the next election is scheduled for September of 2025. However, it is still possible for us to have early elections. There is a lot of dissatisfaction at the current traffic light coalition, the Ampel coalition, which consists of the SPD, the Greens, and the FDP, not only amongst voters, but also amongst the parties themselves. There was an attempt, the FDP actually voted whether or not to remain in the coalition, and they narrowly chose to stay in. However, there is dissatisfaction among the parties and different ministers. And if one of the parties sees that they have a better chance of doing well in the election if they withdraw from the coalition now, they might decide to do that. The FDP has to worry about getting across the 5% threshold to win seats. Right now they're at 4% in the polls, so if they see clearly that pulling out of the coalition early would give them a chance to do better, they might do that, but if not, it's kind of still up in the air. I would say that it's still very possible for us to have early elections, in which case the government would collapse, one of the parties would pull out, and then we would see snap elections a few months later. However, I would say it's not certain. I would say as of now, it's probably more than a 50% chance. It's very likely that we will have the elections as they are scheduled to be held on September of 2025, so next year, but less than a year away. However, it's still possible we could see the government collapse early. So I don't want to completely disclose that from happening, but I would say that as of now, it's expected to happen in September of 2025. Now, as we can see from the polls, the CDU CSU is very dominant here. They have maintained a very strong lead over the past several years, and a lot of this is due to them being the main opposition party. They lost power in 2021 after 16 years of Angela Merkel being Chancellor of Germany from the CDU, and they lost the election narrowly to Olaf Scholz and his SPD in 2021, but less than a year later they came back in the polls challenging the SPD for first place, and they have since, over the past couple of years, been able to expand that margin to around 15 points, so they are clearly ahead, and the SPD has fallen not only to second place but to third place behind the AFD. The AFD has dropped some over the past year, following the EU, or prior to the EU elections, with some of the scandals they had suffered. However, they have maintained their second place lead. But even as we can see, the divide between the AFD, the SPD, is pretty much insignificant to really who's going to win this election, who's going to come first place, and the CDU-CSU is clearly ahead in this lead. Now, it is possible for the SPD to come back, and they were down in the polls from 2018 to pretty much a few months before the election in 2021, and Olaf Scholz personally was more popular than Armin Laschet and was able to kind of carry the party over the line. However, that was an instance where the CDU was in power. They were the incumbent party for 16 years, and the SPD narrowly won. This is going to be very hard for them to pull off. Now, it is true that Friedrich Merz, the candidate of the CDU, is not the most popular, and if the SPD picks someone that is very popular, it is maybe possible for the SPD to win back some support, to gain a leverage. But the precedent for this is, it's going to be very difficult because the SPD is no longer in the opposition. The CDU is now in the opposition. And so I would say there's pretty much a 90% chance that the CDU is not only going to win this election, but win this election by a large margin, a margin of at least 10 points, maybe at least 8 to 12 points, and also will in that case put forward the Chancellor, which will be Friedrich Merz. Now the CDU decided between a few candidates, and Merz, which has been a long time, a leader, prominent person in the party before the Merkel era, and then of course after, he will likely become Chancellor. And regardless of whether or not his personal popularity or unpopularity affects the result, it's clear that the CDU-CSU as a party is so strongly ahead that really nothing is going to matter. Now in this case, I would say the likely coalition is going to be between the CDU-CSU and the SPD. Now, a black-green coalition is possible. That is very popular amongst some in the CDU. However, some, especially those in the CSU in Bavaria, they kind of frown upon that and want to work with the SPD, whereas the Greens are kind of seen is maybe too radical for some in the CDU-CSU. But there are a lot of black-green coalitions across Germany, including in the largest and third largest states. So it's not out of the question, but we do have to worry about they do have to worry about whether or not it's mathematically possible. And right now, black-green does have a majority in the poll, but very narrowly, whereas the grand coalition between the CDU and the SPD has a kind of clear majority in the Bundestag. So I would say as of now, we can expect the CDU to win the election with Merz becoming Chancellor and likely forming a coalition with the SPD. Now, what I also want to take a look at is not just the federal polls, but also look at the polling for the state elections in Germany's three biggest states. Now, none of these three states will be having elections anytime soon, but the polls here do show the extent of the CDU's strength, not only in the states themselves, but also on different levels, the state level versus the national level. That shows that the CDU CSU is pretty much solidifying itself as the dominant party in Germany, and we can see. Interestingly enough, there was a poll in Bavaria that showed the CSU at 43%. This is an increase of what they got in the last state election in Bavaria last year in 2023. We have the AfD actually doing very well in this poll, and then kind of the various left-wing parties and also the Free Voters around 10%. But as you can see by this margin, I mean, the CDU a 20-point lead. And now it's not true that the statewide polls translate exactly to the federal election polls. A lot of the state races, the Landtagswahl have to do with the governors, the personal, popularity or unpopularity of the candidates. So a state poll does not necessarily translate to a federal poll. However, there is some correlation, and I would say in this case there is a lot more because people are less focused on statewide issues. They're going to be thinking about the federal election and kind of voting. And obviously, if you hold a federal election and a state election on the same day, the electorate is going to be somewhat more similar than a state election that is holding its election in an off year. But as you can see, Markus Söder's CSU is very powerful here in the state of Bavaria, and they have not withered over the past years. They are at a historic low, but they have kind of reached. They have at least a floor of around 37%, and they are clearly the largest party. No one can really challenge them, and I expect to see the Bavaria to kind of be a driving factor in the CDU CSU coming first place federally. If they're at 43% here, it's fair to say that they are probably over 40% at the federal level. Now, interestingly enough, and I think this is much more significant, is the state of North Rhine-Westphalia. Now, North Rhine-Westphalia is the biggest state in Germany. It doesn't have it has major cities, but it doesn't have any of the three largest cities, but it has cities such as Cologne, Düsseldorf, Dortmund, the industrial Ruhrgebiet, and also the Rhineland are in this state. And historically, it has been kind of a lean SPD stronghold. It's been a swing state. It's gone back and forth between the CDU and the SPD, but the SPD has kind of been the favorite here. The SPD has, in most cases, or more cases than not, the SPD has won this election both in statewide races and in federal races. So what's interesting here is that the CDU, according to the statewide polling, has built up a 22-point lead ahead of the SPD. I mean, this is tremendous because the CDU is nearing an absolute majority in what used to be a very competitive swing state. And so this state, to be polling at 40% for the CSU and then another, 13% for the AfD, this is the most right-wing that this state has ever been. I mean, this is a very, very bad result for the SPD. And like I said, this is a statewide poll, but we can kind of see here, this is the largest state in Germany, and it's also a state where the SPD should be doing a little bit better than average, which they somewhat are. But this is, a huge margin, and we can see that these large states are driving the factor because, of course, in Eastern Germany, the AfD is doing better than the CDU in some cases. In Brandenburg, we saw the SPD beat the CDU, but those are somewhat smaller states. You also have Hamburg and Rheinland-Pfalz that have incumbent SPD governors that are somewhat popular. But in the three biggest, the three largest states that are going to be driving a lot of the popular nationwide, vote for the federal election, we can see the CDU is very strong and ahead of the other parties. So in NRV, they have a 22% lead at 40%, and they also have the governor here. The incumbent governor is CDU Green. Now, Hendrik Wüst, which is the governor from the state, was a potential person to vie for the chancellor position. He's a bit younger, more progressive leader within the CDU. He is more tolerable and has a more positive view of the CDU Green coalition. However, I would say as of now, that's going to be less viable. But he could potentially become the future leader of the CDU after Merz. And if a governor from the CDU can pull off anything similar to this result, this will translate into him being a very strong politician, not only in this state but also in the CDU party itself. Now, the last state I want to look at is Baden-Württemberg. Now, Baden-Württemberg also is not going to be holding its election for another 2 years. The other ones are going to be a bit longer, but this election is still a ways away. But nonetheless, we can see the polling here. The CDU has a very large lead. Now, Baden-Württemberg is a state that is a traditional heartland stronghold of the CDU. Now, they suffered some losses over the past several years. In the 2011 state elections, the Green Party won second place, surged to 24%, and this was off of the backlash to Germany's nuclear program after the nuclear accident in Japan at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. And so there was a big movement and a big push in Germany to get rid of nuclear energy, and of course that being a prominent issue benefited the Greens, and the Greens were actually able to overtake the CDU in this state, at least in the statewide races. But we can see now that the CDU has made the state once again a stronghold. They have solidified themselves. Not as big in some of the other states because the Greens are still very popular here. And also the AfD is very strong in the state, polling around 17%. This is their best or second best West German state, depending on how Hessen goes. But we see the CDU here, has over a 10-point lead over the Greens. And so if they're getting 33% here, they will likely be getting 33, 34, 35% or more at the federal level. So we see in the three big states, they are clearly ahead. And this is a good sign for the CDU because it shows that the powerhouses, the states with the big populations, are all heavily backing the CDU. And also, these polls do mean something for the state elections that are going to happen. Now, Bavaria isn't going to happen for another 4 years, but Baden-Württemberg will happen in 2 years. And this will probably be the first major electoral test of the incumbent Merz government. I think this election will actually line up to be a very competitive race because we could see the CDU kind of lose some popularity after Merz becomes chancellor, as the SPD did after Scholz. But interestingly enough, the CDU is very strong here. If we look at these three states and look federally, every signal shows that the CDU is on track to win the next federal election by a large margin. Now, of course, historically speaking, this is still low, and in the past, when Germany had pretty much a three-party system between the CDU, the SPD, and the FDP, this is still a historic low, but times have changed, and so the standards have changed. So for modern standards with so many parties, a 32% and over 10-point lead is very significant. Now, the last thing I want to look at is the approval rating for Merz and for Scholz. Now, this does have somewhat of an effect on the election, the personal popularity of the candidates rather than just the parties themselves. Now, early on, both Scholz and Merz struggled with approval ratings. Neither of them were very popular. They kind of had a cap at around 30-35%. So a majority do not approve. However, that is also the case for a lot of the other party leaders. The AfD party leaders, Alice Weidel, and some of the Green candidates are also very low. And so it seems like these numbers are bad, that there would be someone else ahead of them, but that's really not the case. Now, there is some some other ones, such as Markus Söder in the CSU, and then Boris Pistorius, the defense minister from the SPD, that have had some polling showed them significantly higher than their party's chancellor candidates, but they were not chosen. It is still possible that the SPD could change Scholz out for someone else, but I would say as of it hasn't happened yet, and I would say that it's probable. It's fairly likely to say that Scholz will remain as the candidate. And as we can see here, neither of them are really that popular, but Merz has kind of built up and maintained a narrow lead in most of the polls over Olaf Scholz. And so there's not a big enough distinction, there's not a big enough difference in this to make up the difference the CDU has. Now, if Scholz was a lot popular than Merz, we could see that maybe after the debates between Scholz and Merz in 2025, we could see a lot of voters based on the candidacy factor switch over to the SPD, and the SPD could win the election. But we're dealing with a 15-point lead for the CDU according to current polling, and also Merz is more popular than Scholz in the approval rating for the chancellor. So I would say that all metrics as of now are showing that the CDU-CSU is on track for a major historic win, a kind of landslide victory, and the SPD is headed to a historic defeat, a historic kind of disastrous result for the party. Not just the SPD, but the entire incumbent federal government. The Tripartite Coalition will go down as one of the most disapproved and defeated governments in modern German history, and that will be definitely an interesting result to see. Now, of course, we are still a year away, and a lot can change, and as we get closer, I will do more and more videos on the polls and also the different candidates and anything else. And we still have one a state election in Hamburg, not too significant, but it will be another electoral test, another kind of check mark to see what the mood is in Germany. And so I wanted to give you guys this video just to kind of see, shift away from the European elections and the state elections that we had in 2024 and kind of bring focus back to the federal level for the next election in 2025. So that's going to be it for this video. Hope you guys like it. And if you do, please like, share, and subscribe. I will see you all in the next one. Thank you for watching.